Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Johannes Urpelainen, and I'm a professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So welcome to our webinar. We are going to start in just a few minutes. We didn't quite expect 2,500 RSVPs for this webinar, so we are actually right now at capacity. So if you want to stay with us, do not leave the virtual room during the webinar. You won't be able to get back, because we'll start letting other people in. And the way we are going to do this, I'm going to ask our speakers, whom I'll introduce in just 1 or 2 minutes, to give first just brief remarks on the responses and the situation related to the coronavirus in China, Italy, and the United States. And then after that, I will ask a few questions that we've received from via email. And then after that, I'll ask participants to ask questions. Since there's 500 of you in the room, I'm going to ask you to use the chat window. That will be a little less painful, I think, than everybody trying to speak at the same time. And I'm going to ask everybody to stay on mute, because we don't want to get any echo or anything like that during the seminars. Yeah. And we'll start in just 1 or 2 minutes. If you could please stop sharing your screen. I think we have somebody sharing their screen right now. Thank you. Okay, why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on coronavirus responses in China, Italy, and the United States with the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome 3 of our distinguished faculty to this discussion. So I have Professor Eric Jones, hailing from Bologna, Italy. I have Professor Carla Freeman, who is in the China Studies program based here in DC, and I have Professor Andy Murtha, who I think is heading from Ithaca, right? Correct right now? Okay, perfect. And just a quick reminder to everybody that we are recording this video. So if you have any concerns about that, feel free to switch off your video, and just remember that people will see whatever you do if your video is on, just as a little disclaimer. We are going to go for about 1 hour. And as I said, please do include your questions in the chat window. I already see people asking questions. Feel free to ask any time. I keep track of them, and I'll pick and choose as we move forward. But before we get to the question part, I'd just like to ask our 3 faculty members to share their views. So what I'll do first is I'll start with Professor Jones. And so if you could tell us a little bit about what's happening in Italy, where we've seen quite an outbreak of the coronavirus. What are you observing, and what are we learning from this?
Well, first, thank you so much, Johannes, for organizing this event, and thanks to all of you for participating. I'm located in Italy right now, and am talking to you from Bologna, where we've been operating for 65 years as a program of the Johns Hopkins University. I think the first thing that I would say is just how unbelievably quickly this came upon us. At the end of January, we noticed the first case of a foreigner who came into Italy with the coronavirus. The first community transmission was recorded on the 21st of February. We went into lockdown in northern Italy on the 5th of March and have been in lockdown for 3 weeks since then. Now, if you'll look at the statistics, you'll see that the number of new cases has declined somewhat, or at least in terms of growth, but the numbers are staggering in terms of the total amount of the population that's been affected, and most tragically, the number of people who've passed away. Now, the story that I want to tell you is really about the political response, and that's a story that has everything to do with the challenges associated with getting an advanced industrial democracy to accept an unprecedented restriction on freedom of movement. And the freedom of movement that has been restricted in Italy, just to give you a sense of context as an American audience, has progressed from being a kind of a house arrest for people in those areas most affected to being a lockdown of communities in the northern part of the country to being a generalized lockdown. And now increasingly, not only are we prevented from going to fulfill any function outside the home, except those most necessary to keep the economy operated, but we're also prevented from moving from one part of the country to the next. So there is a significant restriction of movement across Italy, as well as from home to work and all the rest. And the fines that are associated with violating this have increased dramatically over the period as well. So now if, for example, you were to get in your car and drive to the next region over, you would probably face a fine of about 4,000 euros. If you were caught being and known to have been positive for the coronavirus, then you would face 5 to 20 years in prison. This is a very significant lockdown that they've imposed. And the political consequences are pretty dramatic because the people are looking at this and there's an enormous amount of approval for the strength that the prime minister has shown, a prime minister that most of us would not have thought would emerge as such a powerful political figure, a reassuring political figure in the context of this crisis. But there's an enormous amount of public approval for the strength that the prime minister has shown and for the calm demeanor with which he's explained some really extraordinary political orders. That said, the opposition is now gearing up to a certain extent and trying to influence the pace of the conversation. And in the most challenging aspect of this is trying to foster a forum for debate between government and opposition, because obviously what you don't want to have is a parliament that sits and brings together, in the case of Italy, almost 1,000 individuals representing different parts of the country who have as their job to go and shake hands with members of the public and record and then repeat their concerns. So when the parliament met today, the political groups that were represented had to accept to send only one representative to the parliament for every 6 who were elected, so that the parliament met in a much reduced sitting and they could maintain the social distancing along the way. Now, the stresses that this has created in Italy between different regions of the country, which have subtly different implementation of the national policies and some policies that they've introduced of their own, have been considerable. And you see tremendous tensions building up between North and South. There are also tensions that are building up between Italy and the outside world, and specifically Italy and the rest of the European Union, where there are open questions as to whether and to what extent the rest of the European Union is going to be able to support Italy in this hour of utmost need. Now, that's a question that doesn't just apply to Italy, it applies to other parts of Europe as well, and perhaps in the conversation about question and answer, we can go into that wider European dimension. I just want to close with the Italian case. And the closure goes like this. We are at this point in Italy 3 weeks into our lockdown and only just now beginning to debate whether we have succeeded in flattening the curve and changing the transmission of this virus. And what this suggests is that we have at least a couple more, if not several more weeks of discipline to maintain in order to put this into a controllable situation. And then we'll have to deal with the fact that it will be very difficult to loosen up the restrictions on freedom of movement without restarting the problem. So we'll have to see how that particular challenge is managed and whether indeed the patience of the population extends all the way into the summer months, because it looks like that's where we're headed. anyway, that would be my introductory remarks, Johannes. Thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Thank you for those remarks. Very useful. I'm just now going to mute everybody one time to make sure that we are disciplined here. As we've learned from Eric, discipline is very important. And then after that, I'm going to unmute people as they speak. Okay, so now we've heard about the situation in Italy. Next, I'd like to ask Professor Murtha to tell us a little bit about what do you see happening in China, and maybe if you can throw in a little bit of comparison also on the situation here in the United States.
Great, thanks so much, Johannes, and thank you all for attending. I actually want to jump on Eric's last point because I think it segues really, really nicely into where we are in understanding China's situation in all of this. So what Eric was starting to say was, we'll see what happens in terms of kind of standing down or opening up and the degree to which, once the curve is flattened, and what the next steps might be, because that's still an open question. And I think China, just given the fact that it was the first, and so it's ahead of pretty much every other country in terms of this larger learning curve, is the next place where we're going to see that hypothesis tested. But what I wanted to do is just step back and just say a few words about kind of how it started, what it underscores, kind of what the lockdown in China actually means and what it has meant, and then kind of lay out about a half dozen just quick observations in terms of what this means more generally. So the first case, reported case, was on November 17th of a 55-year-old man who fell ill. From the end of November into December, you had a growing number of people in the medical community in Wuhan report something that eventually became something of a trend by mid to late December. What you had is, in a response to that, is that you had local governments, you had the mayor in particular, put in a difficult situation in that he was not quite sure of the veracity of the information that he was getting and ended up compartmentalizing it when it really needed to be shared. Now there's some, I'll come back to this in just a few moments, but it underscores one of the main points, which is getting information to the people that are empowered to make decisions, and that's something where China kind of initially fell short. Moreover, you had local authorities punishing various people, including some of the doctors, for spreading rumors, when in fact that was the time when being early was of the essence in terms of informing the general public. You had a couple other situations locally that were problematic. So in the middle of January, the number of cases in Wuhan was officially frozen at 14. And the reason why is because there were two sets of annual meetings, political meetings that went on, and they essentially preempted the kind of knowledge and information flow of what was actually happening in Wuhan. And moreover, later in January, over 40,000 families participated in a potluck banquet to celebrate the Kitchen God Festival in a part of urban district of Wuhan, and that was something that was allowed to take place. Now, meanwhile, while this was happening, you had a lot of people leaving Wuhan, as well as leaving areas of work to go join their families for Spring Festival. And what that did was, what people were afraid of was that was going to spread the virus nationwide. More recently, a former colleague of mine, Jeremy Wallace, has written in The Monkey Cage that in fact that might have led to kind of assist Hubei and Wuhan in quarantining, because a lot of the people got out before they were able to catch it. That remains to be seen. You had a number of different government agencies, both locally as well as nationally, provide different sets of conflicting orders and information, particularly with regards to how things were reported both internally and publicly. And one of the things that we're seeing is China is playing a very, very risky game here in instituting a bifurcated approach to diffuse discontent, which essentially means praising Xi Jinping for his handling of the crisis, while also criticizing local officials for their poor handling of the crisis. And that's something that will be important to monitor to see kind of what happens there. The lockdown itself is one that was instituted in late January, early February, and Wuhan just earlier this week has loosened the crackdown, and it is scheduled to be lifted if things go well in China on April 8th. And so in the meantime, people have been quarantined in their houses. They have, on a community basis, entrances and exit points have been curtailed. Each household is allowed a limited number of entrances and exits. In some areas, there have been curfews, and courier and food delivery personnel are generally prohibited from entering certain communities where the rules are most stringent. I've only touched upon kind of the surface of all of this, but what I'd like to do is just go down a quick list of takeaways from all of this. I'm happy to flesh these out more if people would like me to. So the first is what we really see is a case of political fragmentation among all sorts of different levels, between bureaucracies, between local and central officials, as well as various people who need to cover their tracks. And that has been, I think, a feature of this entire situation in China. We've also seen an ability to mobilize the population, whether it is to mobilize them to stay home or to mobilize them to react in quick order by building hospitals and things like that. And it raises questions of the degree to which China's state capacity is up to the task. The main point, I think, through all of this is the veracity of information. So what kind of information is being produced? Where is it being curtailed? Who's it being sent to? And what is being done on the basis of that information? It raises questions of political legitimacy. So on the, you have two competing narratives going on here. On the one hand, you have Xi Jinping and the central propaganda apparatus essentially underscoring how China has taken a lead in combating this virus. But there's a counter narrative that we're seeing sporadically and anecdotally among social media that is, in fact, far more highly critical of the regime for letting it get out of hand in the first place. One of the things that we're seeing is that the response has been reactive rather than proactive, and it's unclear to me what has been put into place or what can be put into place that would be more proactive looking forward. And then finally, and this is where I'd like to kind of pass the baton to Carla, is that one of the things that this underscores, and China is not alone in this, but there really seems to have been a dearth of international coordination and cooperation on this issue. And that's something that I think has not served the global community well. And it's something that I think if there's a way to improve what we're doing, and if there's a way to see how we do things better moving forward, I think that's a key node to better understand. So let me stop there, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andy, for excellent, insightful remarks. Professor Freeman, could you tell us next a little bit about the international aspects of this coronavirus crisis? For example, how has it influenced the US-China relationship and so on?
Well, thank you. Thank you as well, Johannes, for organizing this. And it's nice to see Eric in Italy, even though he's definitely not left his house in a while. And Andy, thank you for such a good segue. Yes, it's this crisis is not exactly an asteroid hurtling toward Earth that would galvanize the kind of planetary response that some a crisis like that would have, but it has affected the world at a really astoundingly rapid pace. Obviously huge repercussions for global health, but also for economic growth. And instead of being a lesson, as Andy was saying, in international cooperation, it's rather been a lesson in just how challenging in the current international environment it is to come up with some kind of collective response. I should note that this morning, the G20 held an extraordinary meeting virtually. The heads of state met, and they have issued a statement which I haven't yet had a chance to analyze. And I also don't know anything about the politics of the discussion during that meeting. But there was an effort by the G20 to come up with a set of guidelines and goals for the global community, which is very positive. Let me first speak a little bit about China's international response to the coronavirus. It has been engaged fairly early in coronavirus diplomacy, targeting first its own region. And I hope we'll also come to China's mask diplomacy or health Silk Road diplomacy in Europe. Eric touched on that. Maybe we can come back to that topic. But China first began by trying to reassure countries in the region that the virus is something that can be overcome, and that China wanted to contribute to regional efforts to address the epidemic, then global pandemic. It has met with ASEAN. ASEAN, of course, includes many of China's across neighbors along its borders. ASEAN is responding very unevenly to the crisis, and China has been concerned about that, but principally has been engaged in discussions with ASEAN members about keeping trade open and global supply chains or regional supply chains moving. This is very important as well to ASEAN countries, because flows of people have been curtailed as a result of the virus. You know, a country like Thailand is heavily reliant just on tourists from China alone, about 11 million Chinese tourists a year. So limiting Chinese travelers to Thailand there's been an immediate impact on the Thai economy. It's interesting because China has also used this virus as a way to improve relations with some of the regional neighbors that it has the most tensions with, principally Japan. Xi Jinping was supposed to travel to Japan this spring in April. That visit has been delayed, but early on, the Japanese government seized on the opportunity to help organize delivery of medical supplies to China. And since Japan has started to deal with an escalating crisis, the Chinese have also reciprocated by providing offering medical supplies. Relations between those two countries seem to be improving. The US-China relationship is a different matter. Initially, in comments, President Trump was fairly sanguine about China's efforts, and even went so far as to praise Xi Jinping for being on top of the crisis. But overall, the two countries have not come together, and they are critical in organizing an international response. So this is as they did in the midst of the global financial crisis. So this is very disheartening. Of course, it's not that surprising, since the two countries have been engaged in a trade war, and it was only in December and formally in January that the two sides concluded effectively a truce, the phase one trade deal. And I would say that the two countries' relationship at this point is at the lowest point that it's been since normalization. Instead of working together, essentially the two countries have engaged in tit-for-tat criticisms of each other. Many recriminations, allegations have come from the US side about this virus being the product of a Chinese military lab. In turn, and very surprisingly, a Chinese diplomatic spokesman suggested that the virus might have been brought to China by the US military. So some really nasty interactions between the two sides at a time when one would hope that the two countries would be coming together to address this global crisis. I'm hoping that that maybe today's G20 session has yielded some maybe a turnaround in that. But right now, we're in a situation where it's a wait and see to see if the U.S. and China will move forward to take constructive action together.
Excellent. Thank you, Carla. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to just ask a few of these email questions that we've received, and then I'll start asking from the chat. Just a reminder to everybody, the three professors we have here are experts in politics and public policy and international affairs, not in medicine or epidemiology. So I'm going to focus my questions on those that we can get a kind of reasonably informed answer from the three experts here. So first I'd like to start with Andy. So Andy, we have a question here on the data coming out of China. So what is your thinking on the kind of latest announcements about, 0 new cases and all that? Do you trust the data that's coming out, and how should we interpret those?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure my answer is going to be as satisfying as people would like. The problem is that data coming from China in particular, but also from other kind of non-transparent political environments can be biased, but biased in a number of different ways. So if there's a systematic kind of bias, we can control for it. If there isn't, then it becomes somewhat difficult, and one has to really be careful. One of the other problems is that local information available locally might be more useful than once it's aggregated up to the top to national level data, because that then brings in all of it combines and exacerbates all the kind of informational problems that you have. And one of the other problems kind of beyond simply quantitative data is I was in China in 1989 during Tiananmen, and I remember that one of the problems at the time was not that there wasn't enough information, there was too much information, much of it wrong. The degree to which the rumor mill was working on overtime was extraordinary. It got to the point where one was just numb as a reaction, and it was somewhat difficult to figure out kind of what the proper kind of next set of moves would be. I think one of the possible tests will be to see the degree to which, once the containment is rolled back on Wuhan, to see the degree to which there are an uptick in cases or not, as well as the degree to which kind of maverick journalists, activist journalists in China are able to uncover, or people on social media are able to demonstrate things that kind of come against, or that go against the national narrative. But right now, I would be somewhat skeptical, and even these solutions are partial at best. So I think ultimately one has to. I think one has to be critical without being afraid of being labeled as being overly cynical.
Excellent. Thank you, Andy. Eric, there's been a lot of interest both in the email questions and in the chat about the death rate. So for example, there is this idea that in Italy, the death rate is higher than in other countries. Do you have any insights on what's happening here? Why do we see these differing death rates? And does that have something to do with the response, or is it just a kind of demographic factor?
Well, thanks, Johannes. There is a lot of questioning going on about why the death rates are not comparable from one country to the next, when we know human nature is comparable and the virus itself is the same. I would emphasize that part. The best reporting I've read, and as you've mentioned, Johannes, I'm not an epidemiologist or a virologist, the best reporting I've read suggests that there's only one strain of this virus that's traveling around. So the death rates should be the same from one place to the next. But remember, the data is unbelievably noisy, and there is no standardization of the collection techniques from one country to the next. So for example, if you're in Germany and you die being positive for the coronavirus, but you are not dying from the coronavirus, then you would not be recorded as a coronavirus death. If you're in Italy and you have multiple complicating factors, one of which is the coronavirus, then you will always be recorded as a coronavirus death. So the numerator in these ratios is always going to be much larger in Italy than in Germany, for example, because Italians will count everyone who is coronavirus positive as dying from the coronavirus, whereas in Germany, they count only those people who they can trace the death back to the coronavirus. In the denominator, there's a difference as well. In Germany, they are testing much more widely. In Italy, they tend to test only those people for whom they believe there is likely to be a positive. So if you're only testing those people you believe to be positive, you're going to get a significant number of positives that end up being the people who've manifested the symptoms and so end up dying. In Germany, you're going to get a lot of positives among the young population for whom this is a relatively mild illness. And so their death rate looks a lot lower. Those people never would have been tested in the Italian context.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Carla, there's been a lot of interest in the kind of impact of this coronavirus on things like US-China relations, US standing in the world, China's kind of role in the global politics. What do you think is going to be the fallout from all this as we move forward? How is this going to shape these things?
Sorry, that's a great question, but also a really challenging one because we don't know, how the United States is going to handle the virus. And I think right now we're seeing on both sides, both the Chinese side and the US side, effectively really diversionary political tactics aimed in large part at domestic audiences, but also increasingly at partners around the world. For China, it's Belt and Road countries, and for the United States, it's allies and partners around the world. And so it's very hard to sort of sort through all of that noise and get a sense of what might really be happening. There's certain messages coming out of the White House, but meanwhile we do have other officials working with the Chinese and to try to take steps to stabilize the global economy and so forth. So there are things happening behind the scenes, but right now what I see as really discouraging, as I mentioned, is this downward spiral in rhetoric as the two sides the two governments try to make themselves look like they're doing the right thing by essentially blaming each other for problems. I think Xi Jinping in a way has the bigger problem. I mean, he is supposed to do everything right. As Andy mentioned, he has in a very typical tactic, Beijing has blamed local government for mismanaging the initial epidemic and allowing it to balloon into this crisis. But in fact, Xi Jinping is now also not discouraging rhetoric that criticizes the United States and blames the United States effectively, in creating a lot of what some people are calling disinformation about the US role in the virus, and also trying to suggest that that China is the key source of international aid in addressing the crisis, when in fact the United States is the leading donor to the World Health Organization and contributes far and away beyond its assessed contribution. Problem is that that we really have not seen a clear message coming out of the White House that's positive and is something that our allies and partners can focus on. And so we need to see our own government here in the United States formulate a clear message about the virus and about US willingness to provide the global public goods necessary to help address this. We are doing it through contributions to the WHO. We are doing it by taking increasingly strong actions here at home, but we need to send that message. I think if both governments can feel more in control of their home politics, then there'll be some space for us to cool tensions, move forward, and to restart bilateral trade and investment to try to contribute to stabilizing the global economy in this crisis.
Excellent. Thank you, Carla. So we have quite a few questions here on this issue of rebound. So Andy, I'm wondering from your perspective, in China, has there been a discussion of kind of how to react to a possible second wave of the coronavirus? Could you tell us a little bit about that dynamic?
So I can't speak concretely on that, simply because I'm not aware of kind of how those discussions are kind of panning out. But one of the, I mean, I think there's at least two dimensions on which we have to look at this. So one of them is kind of what happens in Wuhan and what happens in Hubei province kind of more broadly, because that is the epicenter in China. Another dimension, and you can split this dimension in two as well, is what about other locales in China? To what degree is information that, that there is actually something going on? So to what degree are there false negatives in various parts of China that are not reporting cases, or to what degree are those actual kind of legitimate and genuine non-outbreaks, if you will? But another question is one that I think we're starting to discuss here in the US, and that is the difference between kind of the urban transmission versus rural transmission. And one of the things that is certainly going to lag is the kind of information that we have from the farther we go into kind of the localities, particularly in rural areas. So I think right now it seems like China is quite confident that they've contained the outbreak within China. But really the next 2-3 weeks are going to be critical in really demonstrating whether or not that is the case. And I think the way in which
I'm trying to listen. Go on.
The way in which things unfold, from that point us to not only understanding the steps that that China will take and the debates leading to them, but also possible lessons for other parts of the world that are, again, half a month to a month behind China on this, in this cycle.
Excellent, thank you, Andy. On that, let's talk a bit about the international level. So I'm going to turn this back to Carla. So Carla, what do you think has been the role of organizations like World Health Organization, United Nations, and so on? Have these organizations been able to respond in any effective manner? And is there any way to improve their global cooperation on this issue?
I think that these organizations have responded the way that they are supposed to. But there has been, I have to acknowledge, there's been some criticism, particularly coming from the United States, of the WHO, because the many critics in the US feel that it did not declare the coronavirus a global pandemic until well after it should have. It did so at the end of January, and meanwhile consistently made positive statements about China's efforts to control the virus. And I think that is because China was taking such extreme action to try to control the spread of the virus, that really on an unprecedented scale, that the WHO leadership felt that it merited commendation for that. But there is a concern in the United States, and again in particular, that the WHO is a bit biased toward China. China has played a significant role in influencing the WHO, mostly on by excluding the Taiwanese from participation in that organization. And given the fact that so many of these epidemics that originate in the region affect Taiwan, that has been a great concern, particularly again in Washington. So on the other hand, these organizations are critical, and it was encouraging to see them have a seat at the table at the G20 meeting again today, and that they will play an important role in discussions and also organizing any kind of global coordinated global response that comes out of these G20 stabilization and response efforts. So that's very encouraging.
So there's also a lot of interest in terms of the response in different countries. And so Eric, I'm wondering, what is your thinking? Good countries like Italy and the United States, are they able to take effective measures? Would they be able to take some sort of more aggressive kind of steps than they've taken so far? And I guess especially in the United States, we've been kind of slow to respond to this. What is your thinking on all this?
There's some very interesting research being done at Oxford University where they're coding national responses in terms of their relative severity and restrictiveness. And one of the coding that I have to dig into more closely shows that the Italian response has actually exceeded the Chinese response in some respects, in terms of the number of people who've been locked down and the scale and dimensions of the lockdown. Which I think is interesting when you imagine the difficulty of doing that in an advanced industrial democracy where people are quite used to a very high degree of freedom of movement. And I think what that suggests is, at least at this early stage, it is possible across very different political systems to impose very tight restrictions. One of the things that may be less possible is to sacrifice other kinds of freedom. And there's an active debate in Europe right now looking at the lessons that have been learned in South Korea and Japan about the use of information derived from cell phones and the geolocation that's involved in that. And some concern in the European context that allowing public health officials access to that kind of geolocation, that kind of personal information, might be a step too far, because it would be very difficult to take that access away once the crisis was completed. So it may be that the restrictions that arise from the political institutions are different from what we might have anticipated ex ante. As we go through this crisis, we're learning a lot about where the true red lines lay and what people are willing to give up to solve a public health crisis.
Excellent. I'm interested in hearing a little more about the situation in the United States. So is anybody on the panel, Andy, Carla, Eric, do you have any thoughts on what could be done here in the United States to get the situation under control? Any thoughts on what kind of responses are both, I guess, politically realistic and would still be at least somewhat effective? So Eric, please.
My only thought is that within the same political unit. The one lesson that we learned quite strongly from the Italian context is you have to apply the same rules. We tried in Italy to apply different rules in the north of country from the south of the country, and that turns out ultimately to have been a mistake, because when we realized we needed to change the regime in the south of the country, a huge number of people, thousands of people, quite literally, left the north of Italy and went to the south of Italy and brought the contagion with them. So as I look at the United States, what I find disconcerting is the freedom of movement still exists, but the variety of treatment in different jurisdictions is extreme. And a last point on this, if you look at the situation in Denmark, Denmark is doing a severe lockdown. Sweden, right across the sea, is trying a very different approach. And those two countries, which have had very close relations for very many years, in the southern part of Sweden and the northern part of Denmark, are actually one urban community in many respects, connected by a bridge, are now being torn apart by the policy difference. And so I think we should be very attentive to that aspect of it as well.
Andy.
Yeah, so I'd like to, first of all, I agree with everything that Eric said, and second it. I think another part of the equation that seems to be missing here, and I do not want this to be misunderstood or misrepresented, but one of the similarities is that President Trump invoked war powers, calling himself a wartime president, and in China, there was a very real war against the virus. And what that kind of rhetoric does is it essentially animates various parts of the state for rapid mobilization in terms of treating the issue. Now, one of the things that we've seen in China is that rapid mobilization began fairly immediately after the call went out, and what you did see was quite literally a kind of a full state approach. I think what we're seeing in the United States is something that is more selective or more tentative, and I think that it makes a very, very big difference if everybody's mobilized all at once, rather than if we kind of do it in a kind of stage by stage process, especially at this point of the curve at which the virus is expanding. So it's an interesting and worthwhile comparison to make, but it's also something that where I see that we could learn a bit from the tendency that oftentimes in China is something that they do too quickly, but to mobilize in response to this epidemic.
Carla.
Oh, thanks. I haven't studied this very carefully, but I think we will all end up looking very closely at the South Korean approach, which really was developed, I think, after the SARS epidemic. There was an effort to ensure that South Korea could respond quickly to an epidemiological crisis. It's also because obviously South Korea is on a wartime footing at all times, and so is a society, sort of organized to respond to crises in a different way. But South Korea had the laws in place, the regulations in place, enabled it to roll out a test very, very rapidly, and its ability to expand testing, get testing, into the thousands very quickly, enabled South Korea to take a different approach that didn't require such a shutdown of its economy, and yet managed to mitigate a health crisis at the same time by early treatment and so forth, and also isolating patients who did have the virus. So by one of the features of the South Korean system as well is that there is universal health care. And so literally the test was free for everyone in certain categories, people who've been exposed to the virus or people who traveled to China and so on. And then, but it was also available at a reasonable cost to people who just wanted to be checked. So there are a lot of lessons that we need to learn from the South Korean approach, I think, and it has been highly effective, really. That numerator has been very small.
Excellent. I'd like to next ask a little bit about the economic aspects of the situation. So starting with you, Eric, could you tell us a little bit about how do you think the efforts to kind of save and stimulate the economy are going to play out in Europe and maybe United States, and what can be done in a situation like this?
Well, the situation in Europe and the situation in the United States is very different because of the existence of welfare state, relatively generous welfare state institutions in the European context, which gives them a little bit longer staying power under lockdown. Having said that, there are three dimensions to the economic response in the European context. One of them has to do with the European Union's willingness to relax the rules on state aid and competition policy. This allows national governments to inject money directly into firms in order to keep them afloat. And so we've begun to see that action taking place already. A second has to do with the intervention of the European Central Bank to provide easy liquidity and indeed even subsidized liquidity to banking systems so that they can keep firms financially liquid, if not solvent. And then the third is what we're seeing roll out piecemeal from one country to the next, which are big active fiscal measures. The Germans have been the most active. Other countries have played a role as well. And this is very different from the United States context, because in the United States, you have a federal government that's able to move with a huge stimulus package. In Europe, it has to be cobbled together piecemeal from one country to the next.
Okay, and what about, I'll ask first Andy and then Carla to answer this. What about China? So what is China doing to kind of get the economy back to action, and what are the options available to China?
So one of the things that we're seeing is that China has been maybe 2 or 3 weeks ahead of the United States in terms of trying to kind of free up the economic and commercial sector there in terms of getting people back to work. The anecdotal information seems to be that a lot fewer people are actually doing that than the official media seems to suggest or imply. I think one of the things that China has maybe benefited from in the very short term is that a lot of what we're kind of the wake-up call that China has been getting from this virus, in a sense, has been anticipated by the worst case scenarios of a breakdown of trade relations between China and the United States, something that China has been dealing with for the better part of the past 18 months or so. This, I don't want to say that it was that things are kind of moving smoothly along that particular learning curve, but China was already facing a number of worst case scenarios there. In terms of being able to pump money into the economy, I mean, that is something that that China is very much able to do. The real question is going to be through what mechanism is it going to do it through? Is it going to be directly to central level fiscal policies and jump-starting state-owned enterprise network, which is something that industrial policy is something that China has been criticized for quite some time, and I think not without reason. But it might be precisely the type of infrastructure necessary to get the economy back up to speed in a kind of an unnaturally short period of time. the degree to which money is downshifted to localities is something that will be, I think, something that they will have to closely monitor in Beijing, because this was, very much a free-for-all following the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. The big question that I have is what does, and I don't have an answer for this, but it's something that we should all be thinking about, because not that long ago, say 2.5 months ago, we were thinking about China in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is something that we have not heard anything from, since the coronavirus story supplanted just about everything else. But the reasons for which China undertook the Belt and Road and the various kind of initial forays it's made into kind of realizing that strategy are going to have to be seriously reconsidered, and may well suggest, imply, and foreshadow a fundamental rethinking of China's economic choices.
Yeah, yeah, just to pick up on a lot of what Andy said, I think, we might think that China would use a lot of the same tools that it did after the global financial crisis, but the economy is very different than it was a decade ago, and so it's more difficult for China to use a sort of massive stimulus package to reignite the economy. There just isn't. One of the reasons for the Belt and Road was to export this excess capacity that China has in terms of infrastructure construction, and that was so important to stimulating the economy after the global financial crisis. China has to come up with other measures, and it's done that through its banking system, raising reserve rates and requirements and lowering reserve requirements and that sort of thing. Also tightening regulations so that employers should keep their employees employed. And importantly, also, as Andy suggested, turning to its state-owned enterprises, which are major employers. And so what we could see is a strengthening of the hand of the state in the Chinese economy as a result of this virus, because those state-owned enterprises become not only major employers, but also channels for the state to use to try to stimulate the local economy. There's some talk that the Belt and Road will still be important to China in moving forward, as it rethinks how to diversify its supply chains to deal with any future crises. And these industrial development zones that are really designed for Chinese enterprise investment may become kind of havens for Chinese production, diversified Chinese production outside of China. So that's going to be very interesting to watch. But we probably will also see a depreciation of the RMB as well. And that may be a politically challenging development in the United States, where we have generally reacted negatively to that, but that may be very important to China getting its economy started again. But a politically challenging move internationally.
I was so sorry, I think there was just some connection lag. So we are approaching the end of our time. So I wanted to just ask a last question, and I'll direct this to Eric. So Eric, what about the political impact of this? What do you think this will do to the presidential elections in the United States and any upcoming European and Italian elections?
I think the political impact in the United States remains to be seen. We know that there's some preliminary polling data that points to a rally around the flag. I think that's a good thing. Nobody wants this government to fail. And the most important thing is for the United States as a people to overcome this crisis, and then we'll sort out the politics later. In the European context, though, there's a much more obvious political dynamic at work, and that is toward the increasing separation of elements in the European Union. And I think that's just problematic. One would hope that the European Union would pull together. If it does not pull together, I think that it will lose support in significant populations, and that would be unfortunate both for Europe and for the United States.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. So I think we are now at the almost at the end of our time. So I thank all three panelists, Professor Murtha, Professor Freeman, Professor Jones, for taking your time and giving us all these excellent insights into what is really the worst public health crisis in a very long time at the global level. And I, of course, thank also all the audience for attending. It's great to have all of you here. And thanks so much for sharing all of your insightful questions. I'm sorry that we weren't able to answer all of them, but with 500 people on the call, I had to moderate a little more aggressively than normally. If you're interested in attending other virtual events in the future, do check out science.jhu.edu/campus-events. I'll put the link into the chat window. It's right there. So you can see there we have a number of events, both related to the coronavirus and related to other kind of timely activities and events and current affairs in the world. So thanks again for attending, and I hope I will see all of you here next time. Bye-bye.